She is 83 years old, sitting in a kitchen that used to be loud. There's a mug in front of her, still full, going cold, because she got lost in a memory before she remembered to drink it. Her daughter had asked her, just a few minutes earlier on the phone, "Mom, if you could go back and tell yourself just one thing, at 50, what would it be?" And there was silence. Not because she didn't know, because she knew immediately, and the answer arrived with so much weight that she had to sit with it before she could say it out loud. You've probably wondered about this too. Maybe about your own parents still here or already gone. Maybe about yourself and the version of you that existed decades ago, moving fast, assuming there would always be more time to slow down later. What if there is one thing, not 10 different pieces of advice, not a list, but one single realization that almost every person who reaches their 80s eventually arrives at? And what if you didn't have to wait until 80 to learn it? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what she said. But first, you need to understand why it took her 30 years to be able to say it. This isn't going to be a list of regrets designed to make you feel behind, or a lecture about wasted time. This is something gentler than that and maybe more useful. Over the next several minutes, we're going to walk through 10 different realizations, 10 different angles on the same central truth that people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s come back to again and again when they talk about the years they wish they'd lived differently. Some of these will be about the people you love. Some will be about the way you treat yourself. Some will surprise you, because they're not the things you'd expect a wise elder to say. And near the end, we're going to bring all 10 of these together into the one thing, the single sentence that so many people only understand when it's almost too late to use it. If you're in your 50s or 60s right now, this video might be the most useful thing you watch this year. And if you're older than that, you'll recognize every word of it as something you already know in your bones, even if no one ever said it to you quite this way. Reason number 1 is the one almost nobody expects, because it doesn't sound like wisdom at first. It sounds like something you already knew. Think about last Tuesday. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blurs into every other Tuesday behind it. You probably filled it well. Emails, errands, a phone call you'd been putting off, dinner made and cleaned up. Maybe the news on in the background while you folded laundry. You were busy. You were, by every modern measure, productive. But can you actually remember it? Not the tasks, the feeling of being alive inside it. This is the first thing people in their 80s tend to say, once they trust you enough to say it plainly. For decades, they mistook motion for meaning. They filled their calendars the way you fill yours, believing, somewhere underneath conscious thought, that a full schedule was proof of a full life. Nobody told them otherwise. If anything, the opposite was true. Busyness was rewarded. It was admired. Someone would ask, "How are you?" And the answer that made you feel most respectable wasn't, "I'm well," or "I'm at peace." It was, "I'm so busy," said almost like a badge. Said often, with a small sigh of pride hidden inside the complaint. Here's what nobody tells you at 50. Busyness is one of the most socially acceptable ways to avoid your own life. Not because you're lazy or unaware, quite the opposite. It's because slowing down forces you to feel things you've been outrunning. Grief you haven't processed. A relationship that needs honesty instead of logistics. A question about whether the life you built is actually the life you wanted, or just the life that kept accumulating while you were focused on the next task. Staying busy lets you postpone that question indefinitely. And postponement, it turns out, is not the same as avoidance forever. It's avoidance with interest. The bill still comes. It just comes later, usually around the time your body slows down whether you want it to or not, and suddenly there's nothing left to hide behind. Think about it from another angle for a moment. Not your own life, but someone you've watched from the outside. Maybe a parent or an older relative who spent their 60s and 70s finally slowing down, and who described that slowing down not as boredom, but as something closer to grief. Grief for the years spent responding instead of living. Grief for conversations they meant to have but kept postponing because there was always something more urgent on the list. That's the quiet tragedy hiding inside a packed calendar. Not that anything on it was wrong, but that all of it together left no room for the parts of life that don't announce themselves as urgent. Love doesn't send a calendar invite. Neither does presence. Neither does simply noticing that you're alive right now in this exact ordinary moment. Those things wait patiently in the background of a busy life, And if you never turn around to look at them, they don't complain. They just quietly recede. There's another version of this same story worth hearing, from a slightly different angle. Talk to someone who was forced to slow down suddenly. A health scare, a job loss, any event that took the choice out of their hands, and you'll often hear something unexpected. Underneath the fear and the disruption, there was also, quietly, a strange kind of relief. For the first time in years, there was nothing to perform, nowhere urgent to be, no calendar dictating the shape of the day. Many describe that forced stillness as the first time in a decade they actually heard their own thoughts clearly, without a task list running underneath them like static. That's a difficult way to learn this lesson, through disruption instead of choice, but it reveals something important. The stillness was available all along. It didn't require the crisis. The crisis just removed every excuse for avoiding it. That's not a character flaw. That's what an entire culture trained you to do. So here's a question worth sitting with, even just for a breath. If your calendar disappeared tomorrow, every task, every obligation, every reason to be busy, what would actually be left of your days? Who would you spend them with? What would you finally have room to feel? That question is uncomfortable on purpose. It's supposed to be, because the people who reach 80 and feel at peace with their lives aren't the ones who did the most. They're the ones who, at some point, made peace with doing less on purpose, and filled that space with something busyness had been quietly crowding out all along. That leads into reason number 2, and this one tends to hit harder than the first because it isn't about time in general, it's about specific people. You know, the phone call you keep meaning to make. Not because anything is wrong, just because it's been 3 weeks or 3 months, and somewhere in the back of your mind you've told yourself, soon. You know, the visit you've been planning to take, the one that keeps sliding from this month to next month. You know, the words you've been meaning to say to someone. Maybe a parent, a sibling, an old friend, words that aren't complicated, just overdue. Ask almost anyone in their 80s what they'd change, and underneath all the different answers, this one keeps surfacing in some form. They waited for the right moment to be close to the people they loved, and the right moment kept not arriving because they were the ones responsible for creating it, and they didn't realize that until much later. Someday is one of the most dangerous words in the English language, precisely because it sounds so reasonable. Someday when things calm down. Someday when the kids are older or younger or out of the house or back in it. Someday when work isn't so demanding, when money is a little more comfortable, when there's finally enough breathing room to give people the attention they deserve. Someday operates on the assumption that the people you love, and the version of you capable of showing up for them, will simply be waiting unchanged whenever you finally get around to it. But relationships aren't static. They're living things, and living things either grow or they quietly wither from neglect. Not dramatic neglect, just the slow, invisible kind that happens when soon becomes a permanent address instead of a temporary one. A parent doesn't stay the version of themselves you remember from your 30s. A friendship doesn't hold itself together indefinitely on the fumes of what it used to be. Children grow up whether or not you were paying full attention while it happened, and one day you look up and the closeness you assumed you'd get back to later has become a stranger's kind of closeness. Polite, a little careful, missing the ease it used to have. Here's the part that's harder to hear. This isn't only about the people who are gone. It's just as often about the people who are still here. A sibling you've drifted from over something neither of you quite remembers. A friend who moved away and became a Christmas card instead of a real presence in your life. A child who calls out of obligation now instead of eagerness. Distance doesn't require death. It just requires time, unattended. And here's the other side of it, seen from someone who was on the receiving end. Think about anyone who has ever waited for a call that didn't come, or wondered if they mattered enough to be sought out rather than merely accommodated when convenient. That waiting has weight too. It shapes how loved a person feels, long before anyone says a word about it out loud. That's not something you can undo by trying harder later. But it is something you can start correcting today in a way that costs you almost nothing. A phone call, an honest sentence, a visit you stop postponing. There's a particular kind of regret people describe here, one that's different from most others on this list, because it isn't about a single decision. It's about an accumulation of small non-decisions, the call not made this week, and then not made the next, and then the habit of not calling becoming so established that eventually it stops even registering as a choice. Nobody sits down and decides, once, to drift from someone they love. It happens one skipped Sunday at a time, until enough Sundays have passed that reaching back out feels awkward simply because of how long it's been, which, ironically, becomes one more reason to keep postponing it. That's not sentimentality. That's the most practical investment you'll ever make, because unlike money or career, closeness doesn't compound on its own. It only grows if someone tends to it. So if there's a name sitting in the back of your mind right now, and you already know there is, that's not a coincidence. That's the part of you that already understands reason number 2 better than any list ever could. Which brings us to reason number 3, and it's one that quietly shaped almost every decision in the first half of most people's lives without ever announcing itself by name. How many times have you chosen the safer version of something, the safer opinion, the safer outfit, the safer path? Not because it was what you actually wanted, but because you were managing what someone else might think of you. Not a stranger, usually. Often someone close, parent, a spouse, community you didn't want to disappoint. People in their 80s describe this one with a particular kind of exhausted honesty, almost embarrassed by how much of their younger life was spent performing for an audience that, in hindsight, was barely paying attention. You spend your 20s worrying about what your peers think. You spend your 30s and 40s worrying about what your children, your colleagues, your extended family think. And somewhere around 70 or 80, a strange and liberating realization arrives. Almost none of those people were watching as closely as you assumed. Everyone was too busy managing their own imagined audience to fully notice yours. The performance was real to you. To everyone else, it was mostly background noise in a life they were living just as anxiously as you were living yours. This matters because fear of judgment doesn't just influence small choices, what you wear, what you say at dinner. It shapes the large ones too. The career you didn't pursue because it seemed impractical to people whose opinions you'd given too much power. The creative pursuit you quietly abandoned because someone once implied it was frivolous. The relationship you stayed in or left, based on what would look right rather than what would feel true. Multiply that across decades and you get something that's hard to name precisely, but easy to feel. A life that technically belonged to you, lived according to specifications set by someone else's imagined opinion. Now consider it from a different vantage point, the people whose opinions felt so important at the time. Most of them, if you could ask them honestly today, would admit they don't remember the moment you're still carrying. The outfit you agonized over. The comment you replayed for a week. It left almost no trace in their memory, because they were consumed by their own version of the same anxiety. That's not a comforting coincidence. That's the actual mechanism behind almost all social fear. Everyone assumes they're the only one being watched, when in truth everyone is far too occupied watching themselves. Think about a specific version of this one almost everyone has some variation of. A hobby quietly abandoned because it seemed a little embarrassing for someone your age. An opinion at a family gathering swallowed rather than spoken, because disagreement felt riskier than silence. A dream, moving somewhere new, starting something different, ending something that no longer fit. Set aside because it would have required an explanation you didn't want to give. None of these moments felt dramatic at the time. That's exactly what made them so effective. A dramatic loss gets noticed and mourned. A quiet, ongoing accommodation to imagined judgment just gets absorbed into the texture of an ordinary life, indistinguishable over enough years from simply who you are. That's not vanity, by the way, on anyone's part. That's just what a nervous system trained by decades of social conditioning does by default. Here's what changes it, eventually, for almost everyone who reaches old age. The audience gets smaller. Not because people stop caring about you, but because you stop needing their permission to be yourself. There's a particular freedom that tends to arrive later in life, and it isn't resignation, it's clarity. The realization that you were never actually required to earn approval you already had, or to avoid disapproval that was never going to be as devastating as it felt in the moment. That's not something you have to wait until 80 to access. It's available right now, the moment you're willing to ask yourself honestly, how much of today's version of you exists because it's genuinely who you are, and how much exists because it's who you think you're supposed to be for someone who, statistically, probably isn't paying nearly as close attention as you assume. 3 reasons in, and if you're starting to notice a pattern in your own life, good. That's exactly the point. Because reason number 4 is where things get a little more physical and a little harder to hear. Reason number 4 is one that people tend to say almost apologetically, because it sounds obvious once it's said out loud, and yet almost nobody actually lives as if they believe it until it's tested. Think about the last time you climbed a flight of stairs without thinking about it, or carried groceries in from the car in one trip because it simply didn't occur to you not to, or woke up and simply got out of bed. No negotiation with your own body required. You probably don't remember it specifically because it wasn't memorable. It was just Tuesday, again, ordinary, unnoticed, completely taken for granted. People who've lived into their 80s and 90s talk about their younger, more capable bodies the way you might talk about a friend you didn't fully appreciate until they moved away. Not with drama, with a kind of quiet, retrospective tenderness. They didn't waste those years being unhealthy necessarily. Plenty of them took reasonably good care of themselves. What they regret isn't neglect. It's something subtler, the failure to notice in real time what an extraordinary gift ordinary capability actually was. The ability to move through the world without a second thought toward your own body. The energy to say yes to something spontaneous without calculating the cost of recovery afterward. The simple, uncelebrated luxury of not thinking about your body at all, because it was quietly doing its job in the background of a life focused on everything else. This isn't about fear, and it isn't a warning dressed up as wisdom. It's an invitation to notice something you might be walking past every single day. Because here's what tends to happen as the decades accumulate. Capability doesn't announce its own decline. It doesn't send a warning a year in advance. It erodes so gradually that you barely notice the difference between last year and this one, until you look back 10 years, and the gap is undeniable. By the time most people fully register what they had, they're already living with less of it. And what they wish, more than anything, isn't that they'd feared losing it. It's that they'd actually inhabited it, moved through those capable years with some awareness and gratitude, instead of simply assuming that version of themselves was permanent. Consider it from another angle too. Someone who experienced a temporary limitation earlier in life, even something minor, a passing injury, an illness that resolved. Almost universally, they describe the same thing once it resolved. A brief window of profound appreciation for ordinary movement, for a body that simply worked, followed, almost embarrassingly quickly, by a return to taking it entirely for granted again. That's not a personal failure. That's how human attention works. We are built to adapt to what's normal, and normal, by definition, stops registering as remarkable. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's simply what makes today worth noticing on purpose, rather than waiting for contrast to force the noticing later. There's a related version of this that people mention almost as an afterthought, though it may matter just as much. The energy for spontaneity. Not physical strength exactly, but the willingness, the capacity to say yes to something unplanned. A last-minute trip, a long walk with no destination, staying up later than usual because the conversation was good. That kind of openness has its own quiet window too, and it tends to narrow gradually, alongside everything else, without ever sending a formal notice that it's happening. People who watched that window narrow in themselves often describe wishing they'd said yes more often while saying yes still felt easy, rather than saving spontaneity for a someday that assumed the same ease would still be waiting for them. So here's a small, almost embarrassingly simple practice worth considering. Today, at some point, pay attention, really pay attention, to your body doing something ordinary. Walking, reaching for something on a shelf, standing up from a chair without help. Not because something is wrong with it, precisely because nothing is. That kind of attention, paid early and often, is exactly what people in their 80s say they wish they'd offered their younger selves. Not fear, not obsession, just quiet, genuine gratitude, offered while there was still so much of it left to be grateful for. That same kind of attention, noticing what you have before it's gone, applies to something else too, something less physical and more emotional. There's a version of reason number 5 that almost everyone recognizes immediately, even if they've never said it out loud. The name of someone you haven't forgiven. Maybe it's a parent who failed you in a specific, nameable way. Maybe it's a sibling over something that started small and calcified into years of distance. Maybe it's a former friend, a former spouse, someone who hurt you enough that you built a small, permanent room in your mind just to keep replaying it. You know the story by heart. You could tell it in your sleep, complete with exactly how it wasn't your fault, and exactly how much it cost you. People in their 80s talk about grudges with a specific kind of weariness, not because they've necessarily forgiven everything, but because they've had enough decades to observe what carrying resentment actually does over time, and it isn't what they expected when they were younger. When you're 50, holding on to anger can feel like justice. It feels like proof that what happened to you mattered, like releasing it would mean the offense didn't count. But ask someone 30 years further down the road, and you'll often hear something surprising. The anger didn't punish the person who hurt them nearly as much as it punished the person holding on to it. Many of the people who wronged them moved on entirely, sometimes without a second thought, while the grudge kept living rent-free inside the very person trying to protect themselves with it. This is the part that's genuinely hard to accept, so it's worth saying carefully. Forgiveness was never really about the other person. It was never a statement that what happened was acceptable, or that accountability doesn't matter. It's something else entirely, a decision to stop paying an ongoing tax on an event that already happened, to someone who, in many cases, isn't even aware they're still being paid. Unforgiveness has a strange shape. It feels like strength, like vigilance, like refusing to be a pushover. But held long enough, it becomes something closer to a wound that keeps reopening itself, on a schedule set entirely by you. Look at it from the outside for a moment. Imagine two people who experienced nearly identical betrayals at similar points in life. One spent the following decades still narrating the injustice, still tightening around it a little more each time it came up. The other, without excusing what happened, eventually set it down. Not for the other person's sake, and not even necessarily through some dramatic reconciliation, but simply because they got tired of living inside the same wound year after year. Ask which of those two people describes themselves as at peace by 80, and the answer is rarely surprising. That's not weakness. That's someone finally refusing to let one moment from decades ago keep dictating the texture of their present. This doesn't mean every relationship deserves to be rebuilt, or every person deserves renewed access to your life. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, and one doesn't require the other. You can release the weight of something without inviting the person who caused it back into your daily life. What forgiveness actually asks of you is smaller and, in its own way, harder. Simply to stop being the one who keeps the wound open, long after the person who caused it has, in most cases, stopped thinking about it entirely. It's worth being honest, too, that some grudges are carried toward people who are already gone. A parent, most often, who died before any real conversation could happen. That version is its own particular weight because there's no phone call left to make, no chance for the other person to finally understand what it cost you. And yet people who've lived with this describe, eventually, a way through it that doesn't require the other person at all. Writing the words down that were never said out loud, speaking them to an empty room, or simply deciding, privately and deliberately, that the account is closed. It isn't the same as reconciliation, but it can still be release, and release is the part that was actually needed all along. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Is there a name you're still carrying? And if so, not for their sake, but for yours, what would it feel like to finally put it down? We're now about halfway through this list, and I want to pause here for just a moment because something happens to most people around this point in a video like this. Your mind starts doing quiet math, attaching names to reasons, remembering specific moments, maybe feeling a little exposed by how accurately some of this lands. That's exactly where you're supposed to be right now. Don't rush past it. The next 5 reasons go somewhere a little different than the first 5, less about what you did with your time, and more about how you treated the person living inside it, yourself. If the first half of this list felt like it was describing your relationships with others, the second half is going to start turning the mirror around. Reason number 6 is where that begins. Reason number 6 is the one that surprises people the most, because it contradicts almost everything you were taught to chase. Picture the goal you were once convinced would finally make you feel settled. The promotion, the paid-off house, the number in the bank account that meant you'd finally made it. Maybe you reached it. Maybe you're still reaching for it. Either way, ask yourself honestly, did arriving there feel the way you expected it to feel? Or did the relief last for a strangely short time before some new target quietly took its place? This is one of the most consistent things people describe once they've had decades to test the theory. Achievement delivers exactly what it promises and nothing more. It delivers the promotion, the house, the number. What it doesn't deliver, no matter how large the achievement, is the deep, settled peace you were implicitly promised would come attached to it. That peace was never actually for sale. It was something else entirely, Something achievement can only ever imitate for a few weeks at a time before the imitation wears off and you're back to searching for the next milestone to chase it with. There's a well-documented pattern behind this, the way satisfaction from an accomplishment fades faster than expected, leaving you back at your emotional baseline and already eyeing the next target. But you don't need a technical name for it to recognize the feeling. You've lived it. Everyone has. Here's the layer underneath that most people don't examine until much later. Achievement was never actually the goal. It was a stand-in for something harder to name and harder to pursue directly. Feeling worthy, feeling secure, feeling like you'd finally proven something to someone, sometimes someone who was never going to be satisfied no matter what you accomplished, sometimes someone who wasn't even paying attention. Chasing achievement is so appealing precisely because it's concrete. You can see a promotion. You can count money. You can't as easily measure whether you feel loved or whether you're actually at peace with who you are. So the mind, understandably, gravitates toward the thing it can measure, hoping the immeasurable thing will show up as a side effect. Consider it from someone who had the opposite experience. Someone who, for whatever reason, never reached the external markers they were chasing. Interview enough people in their 80s and you'll find plenty who never became wealthy, never reached the career peak they once wanted, and who are nonetheless deeply at peace, because somewhere along the way, they stopped waiting for an external number to grant them permission to feel that peace, and simply built it directly out of relationships and presence and small daily choices, instead of waiting for it to arrive as a reward. Here's a question worth holding on to for the rest of this video. If you reached every single goal you're currently chasing tomorrow all at once, would you actually feel different underneath it, or would you just feel the same, standing on slightly higher ground? That's not cynicism about ambition. Ambition isn't the problem. It's the quiet assumption riding along with it. That peace is a prize waiting at the finish line. That turns out to be the part worth questioning. There's a familiar pattern hiding underneath a lot of this. The goalpost that keeps moving. You wanted a certain salary, and reaching it quietly, you began wanting the next one. You wanted a certain size of home, and once you had it, some other measure of enough took its place almost immediately, as if satisfaction had a built-in expiration date designed specifically to keep you reaching. This isn't a personal weakness. It's closer to a design feature of how ambition works when it's disconnected from an internal sense of enough. Without that internal anchor, no external number will ever feel like a rival. It will just feel like the new starting line. So the achievement isn't the villain here. It never was. The villain is the belief that it was ever supposed to deliver something it was never capable of delivering in the first place. Once that belief loosens its grip, achievement can finally be what it was always meant to be. Something you do because it's meaningful, not something you chase because you're hoping it will finally make you feel enough. 6 down for to go. And this next one is the one that tends to catch people completely off guard because it isn't really about a lesson at all. It's about the strange, slippery nature of time itself. Reason number 7 is less something people learned, and more something that happened to them almost without their permission. Do you remember how long a summer used to last? Back when you were young enough that a single season felt like its own small era. Now think about how quickly last year went. Not metaphorically, actually think about it. Could you account for all 12 months? Or does the whole year compress into a handful of scattered memories, with long unmarked stretches in between where, if you're honest, nothing particularly distinguishable happened at all? This is one of the strangest things people in their 80s describe, and it isn't sentimentality. There's real psychology underneath it. Your brain measures time partly by novelty. New experiences, new places, new milestones. First job, first home, first child, first everything. Get encoded richly with detail, which is why your 20s can feel, in memory, like they lasted longer than they actually did. But as life settles into routine, especially after the major milestones stop arriving on a predictable schedule, the brain has less new material to encode. Days start to resemble each other. And when days resemble each other closely enough, your mind quietly compresses them together in memory. The same way a photo album with 500 nearly identical pictures gets remembered as roughly one blurred impression instead of 500 distinct moments. That's why time seems to accelerate as you age. Not because the clock is actually moving faster, but because your mind is recording fewer distinguishable moments to measure it by. Here's what makes this reason different from the others. It isn't a mistake you can go back and correct. Nobody chooses to stop noticing time. It happens gradually as a side effect of stability, and stability itself isn't something to regret. A settled, routine life has real value. But once you understand the mechanism, something practical emerges from it. If sameness is what causes time to blur, then novelty, even small, unremarkable novelty, is what slows it back down. A new route walked instead of the familiar one. A conversation with a stranger instead of silence. Trying something you've never tried, even something small on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. None of it requires drama or expense. It only requires interrupting the sameness enough that your mind has something new to hold on to. Consider this from the perspective of someone who spent a long stretch of life in an unusually demanding, high-novelty period. A difficult move, a major life transition, a period of real upheaval. Almost universally, people remember those stretches as feeling longer in retrospect than they did while living through them, precisely because there was so much unfamiliar material for the mind to record. It's strange, but true. The hardest years are often the ones that stretch the most in memory, while the comfortable years compress into almost nothing. Let that sit with you for a moment. Not as pressure to disrupt your life, just as a quiet reminder that time isn't actually accelerating. Your attention to it is what's shrinking, and attention, unlike the clock, is something you still have some say over. People who found their own way of slowing this down often mention small, almost unremarkable habits. Writing a single line about the day before bed, taking a photograph of something ordinary rather than only the milestones, saying the date out loud on a walk just to notice it. None of these habits feel significant while you're doing them. That's precisely the point. Their entire value comes from creating a small marker, a tiny piece of novelty, that your memory can later use to tell 1 week apart from the next, instead of letting an entire season dissolve into an undifferentiated blur. That's not a flaw in how your mind works. That's simply how memory decides what deserves to be kept. There's a moment that tends to arrive somewhere in the last years of a long life. Not everyone describes it in the same words, but almost everyone describes something close to it. A stillness. A clarity that finally settles after decades of noise. It usually doesn't arrive during a triumph. It arrives in something quiet. A hand held in a hospital room. An ordinary afternoon with grandchildren playing in the next room. A sunset watched from a porch instead of rushed past on the way to somewhere else. In that stillness, almost everyone arrives at some version of the same sentence. A hospice nurse who spent decades sitting with people in their final months once put it simply, nobody at the very end wishes they had built a bigger life. They wish they had been more present inside the one they had. Sit with that for a second. Not the achievements, not the busyness, not even the years themselves, however many or few there turned out to be. What people return to at the very end is presence, whether they were actually there, fully, for the moments that made up their days. That's not a small thing to realize. That's the thread running underneath everything you've heard so far in this video. And it's about to become the thread that ties all 10 reasons together. That stillness leads directly into reason number 8, because it's about exactly the kind of moment that stillness reveals. The words you assumed people already knew. Have you ever loved someone deeply and simply not said it? Not out of coldness, just out of assumption. Surely they know. Surely it's obvious, given everything you do for them, everything you've built together, the sheer number of years you've shown up. Why would you need to say it out loud? This is one of the most quietly devastating patterns people describe once they've lost someone they loved deeply without ever quite saying so. Or once they've reached an age where they finally understand how badly they themselves needed to hear it from others. Actions matter, nobody's disputing that. Showing up, providing, staying, sacrificing. These are real expressions of love, and they count. But somewhere along the way, many people convinced themselves that actions were a substitute for words, rather than a companion to them. And the people receiving those actions, especially children, spent years quietly wondering, in some private unspoken corner of themselves, whether they were actually loved or merely being responsibly managed. Here's the psychology underneath this: humans don't just need to be loved. They need to know they're loved, in language specific enough that there's no ambiguity left to privately worry about. A provided home says, I take my responsibilities seriously. It doesn't automatically say, I love you specifically, for exactly who you are. Those are different messages, and only one of them requires actual words. Silence, even well-intentioned silence, leaves room for doubt to fill the space where certainty should have been. And doubt, given enough time, calcifies into distance, not because love wasn't there, but because it was never confirmed clearly enough to be trusted completely. Look at this from the other direction for a moment. Think about the last time someone told you plainly and specifically that they loved you, not as a sign-off on a phone call said automatically, but really said, meant, landed. If you can remember it, you probably remember exactly where you were. That's how rare and how powerful specific, spoken love actually is. It doesn't fade the way a general sense of care can fade in memory. Stays whole, retrievable for years. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. If something happened to you tonight, is there anyone who would be left wondering whether you truly knew how they felt about you, or wondering whether you actually knew how you felt about them? That question isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to make the next phone call, the next visit, the next ordinary Tuesday conversation feel a little less optional than it usually does. That's not oversharing. That's simply closing a gap that silence, however well-meaning, quietly leaves open. This tends to run in both directions across generations, too. Someone who grew up in a home where love was demonstrated but rarely spoken often carries that same pattern forward into their own family, without ever intending to. It isn't a failure of love. It's simply the only language that was modeled. Breaking that pattern doesn't require blaming anyone who came before you. It only requires noticing that the pattern exists and deciding deliberately that it stops being passed down starting with you. The good news buried inside reason number 8 is that it costs almost nothing to correct. Not therapy, not a grand gesture, not a life-altering decision. Just 3 words said plainly, to the specific person who needs to hear them, sooner rather than later, because they already know is one of the most common last thoughts people carry into a goodbye they didn't expect to be final. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a video you're just half watching in the background. You're not just letting this play while you do something else, you're actually here, actually letting some of this land, and that says something about you. It says you're the kind of person who's willing to look honestly at your own life, even when it's a little uncomfortable, which, if we're being honest, is rarer than it should be. So thank you for staying. What's left isn't more of the same. The final 2 reasons are, in some ways, the gentlest of the 10, less about correcting a mistake, and more about giving yourself permission for something most people never fully allow themselves. And then, right after that, we're finally going to answer the question this whole video opened with, what that 83-year-old woman actually said to her daughter. Which brings us to reason number 9, permission. Specifically, permission to rest without earning it first. How often do you allow yourself to simply sit, doing nothing productive, without a small voice somewhere reminding you of everything else you could be doing instead? Not resting because you collapsed from exhaustion. Resting on purpose, guilt-free, as a complete sentence with no justification attached. For most people, that kind of rest is almost impossible to access, because somewhere early in life, rest got quietly redefined as something you had to earn. Rest after you finish the list. Rest after the house is clean. Rest after you've proven, yet again, that you deserve it through enough visible effort. People who reach their 80s, looking back, often describe an exhausting, decades-long relationship with guilt around anything that looked like idleness, even when that idleness was exactly what their mind and body needed. And the tragedy isn't that they rested too little in any single week. It's that they spent so many of those weeks unable to actually enjoy the rest they did get, because guilt sat right alongside it the entire time, quietly insisting they should be doing something else. Here's what's underneath that guilt, if you trace it back far enough. A belief, absorbed early and rarely questioned, that your worth is tied to your output, that you are only as valuable as what you produce, what you accomplish, what you visibly contribute on any given day. It's an exhausting belief to carry, and it's also, when you examine it honestly, simply untrue. Your worth isn't something you generate through effort. It was never up for negotiation in the first place. But try telling that to a mind trained for decades to equate stillness with laziness, and laziness with some quiet, unspoken form of failure. Consider this from a different vantage point. Think about how you'd feel watching someone you love running themselves into the ground, refusing to rest, apologizing every time they sat still for more than a few minutes. You wouldn't see discipline in that. You'd see something closer to self-neglect, and you'd want, more than almost anything, to give that person permission to simply stop for a while. Strange, isn't it, how easily we extend a kindness to others that we refuse to extend to ourselves? Here's the question worth pausing on. What would it actually feel like, not intellectually but in your body, to rest today without a single justification attached to it? No, I earned this. No, I'll get back to it after. Just rest as a complete thought. That's not laziness. That's finally treating yourself the way you'd treat someone you loved. It's worth naming where this guilt so often comes from, because it rarely originates with the person carrying it. Many people absorbed it early, from a household or a generation, that equated constant motion with virtue and stillness with something close to shame. That message can be inherited without a single word ever being said directly, just watched over and over in the adults around you until it's settled in as simply how a responsible person behaves. Recognizing that the belief was inherited, rather than chosen, doesn't undo it overnight. But it does loosen its grip a little because it becomes easier to question something you can see was handed to you, rather than something that feels like an unchangeable part of who you are. The people who reach 80 at peace with themselves aren't the ones who rested the most or the least. They're the ones who eventually stopped needing permission from anyone, including themselves, to simply be a person, and not only a producer of things. That shift, small, quiet, almost invisible from the outside, turns out to be one of the most important ones a person can make, and the earlier it happens, the more decades there are left to actually enjoy the difference it makes. One reason left, and it's the one that quietly ties every single other reason on this list together, which is exactly why it's saved for last. Reason number 10 isn't really a new idea. It's what all 9 of the others were pointing toward the entire time, even if it wasn't named directly until now. Try this for a moment. Think back on your life, and try to name the days you'd give almost anything to live again. Not the wedding, necessarily, or the graduation, or the big vacation you saved years for, though those matter too. Think harder. Often, what surfaces instead is something smaller. An ordinary Sunday morning with someone who isn't here anymore. Making breakfast, half listening to the radio, nothing remarkable happening at all. A car ride with your kids when they were small, singing along badly to something on the radio, nowhere important to be. A conversation on a porch that lasted longer than it needed to, for no particular reason, just because neither of you wanted it to end yet. This is what people in their 80s and 90s consistently, almost universally, come back to. It's the ordinary days they miss the most, not the extraordinary ones. The extraordinary days were rare by definition, a handful scattered across an entire life. But the ordinary ones, the unremarkable Tuesdays and quiet Sunday mornings, made up the overwhelming majority of the time they actually had with the people they loved. And it was precisely because those days felt so unremarkable while they were happening that almost nobody thought to treasure them at the time. You don't cherish a Tuesday. You just live through it, assuming there will be another one exactly like it indefinitely until one day there isn't. Here's the thread that connects everything you've heard in this video, if you look closely. Reason 1 was about mistaking busyness for meaning, busyness that crowded out ordinary time together. Reason 2 was about postponing closeness, assuming someday would preserve the ordinary days you were skipping. Reason 5, forgiveness, was about refusing to let old wounds keep consuming ordinary present time that could have been spent differently. Reason 8, saying the words out loud, was about making sure the people sharing your ordinary days actually knew what those days meant. Every single reason on this list, from a different angle, points toward the exact same conclusion. The ordinary, unremarkable, unrepeatable present moment, the one you're in literally right now watching this, is not a placeholder on the way to something more important. It is the thing itself. It was always the thing itself. Consider it from the perspective of someone standing at the very end, looking back across an entire life at once, the way people often describe doing in their final months. From that vantage point, the milestones shrink down to a handful of bright, isolated points, and everything in between, all those ordinary days that felt too unremarkable to notice at the time, expand to fill almost the entire view. That's the great, quiet reversal that waits at the end of a long life. The days you paid the least attention to turn out to be the ones that made up almost everything. That's not a tragedy. That's an instruction arriving early enough, if you're willing to listen to it, that you still have time to use it. There's a simple way to test this in your own life right now without waiting decades to confirm it. Think about someone you've lost, or someone who's simply far away now. Try to picture a specific memory of them. Notice what actually comes up first. It's rarely a milestone. It's usually something small, the particular way they laughed at something unremarkable, the sound of a kitchen in the morning, an ordinary errand done together for no reason worth remembering except that you were together while you did it. If your memory already knows this, if it already reaches for the ordinary moments before the extraordinary ones, then some part of you has known reason number 10 all along. This video is simply asking you to start living like you know it, today, rather than only recognizing it in hindsight. So here, finally, is the question reason number 10 leaves you with, and it's the same question this entire video has been circling from the very first sentence. If today, this completely ordinary day, whatever it looks like for you, turned out to be one you'd give almost anything to live again someday, would you have spent it any differently? You don't need an 83rd birthday to answer that question honestly. You only need to be willing to ask it now, while there's still time left to change how you answer it. Remember the woman from the beginning of this video? 83 years old, sitting in a kitchen that used to be louder, a phone call with her daughter still warm in her hand, a question sitting in the air between them. If she could go back and tell herself just one thing at 50, what would it be? Here's what she finally said, after that long silence. Stop waiting for the ordinary days to become extraordinary before you start paying attention to them. They already are. You just didn't know it yet. That's the one thing, underneath everything you've heard in the last several minutes. The busyness, the postponed closeness, the fear of judgment, the body you stopped noticing, the grudges, the achievements that never quite delivered, the years that started blurring together, the words left unsaid, the rest you never allowed yourself, the ordinary days you rushed through. It all comes back to that single realization. Presence isn't something you'll finally have time for later. It's available right now, in whatever unremarkable moment you happen to be living through today, if you're willing to actually notice it instead of waiting for a more important-looking moment to arrive first. You don't have to overhaul your entire life to start living this. You just have to be a little more here, in the next conversation, the next ordinary Tuesday, the next quiet moment with someone you love, than you were yesterday. That's the whole practice. It's smaller than it sounds, and somehow it's also everything. Think back one more time to that kitchen at the start of this video. What made that moment matter wasn't a milestone. It was a mug of tea going cold while a mother and daughter simply talked, honestly, about something that mattered. That's the whole lesson, hiding in plain sight, in the very story used to tell it. Ordinary, unremarkable, and, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of moment reason number 10 spent this entire video trying to teach you to notice. If this video gave you something worth sitting with today, consider staying a little longer around here. This channel exists for exactly this quiet, honest reflection, the kind of wisdom that usually takes decades to earn, offered a little earlier than that so you have more time to actually use it. Subscribe if you'd like more of these conversations to find you. And whatever today looks like for you, ordinary or otherwise, try just for today to actually be inside it. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'll see you in the next one.